Let me be honest with you. I used to think emotional detachment was just another word for numbing out, something cold, something people did when they couldn't handle life. But here's what I've learned. In a world that's constantly asking for more of us, more time, more energy, more response, more engagement, detachment isn't about disconnecting from people or purpose. It's about protecting our peace so we can stay connected to what really matters. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one night, inbox overflowing, text unread, kids needing me, work calling, and realizing I was there, but not really there. That kind of split where your body's in the room, but your soul's already burnt out. That's not presence. That's survival mode. And survival mode doesn't build a life, it just gets through it. So let's talk about how emotional detachment, not avoidance, not numbing, but intentional space, can actually be the path back to our most courageous, grounded selves. Emotional detachment isn't disconnection, it's discernment. When we set healthy emotional boundaries, we're not withdrawing from people, we're protecting the clarity we need to show up fully and freely. It took me a long time to learn that there's a difference between shutting down and stepping back. I used to think emotional detachment meant checking out, that it was a defense mechanism for people who couldn't handle intimacy. But what I discovered through years of research, and more importantly, real life, is that intentional detachment isn't about putting up walls. It's about creating space where we can actually breathe, assess, and choose a wise response instead of a wounded one. The difference is discernment. Discernment is our ability to say, this is what's mine and this is what's not. It's that quiet, steady voice inside that helps us separate noise from truth. But here's the kicker. Discernment doesn't work when we're emotionally flooded. When you're knee-deep in everyone else's urgency, opinions, or expectations, it becomes almost impossible to hear your own voice over the chaos. And that's where emotional detachment comes in. When I interviewed hundreds of people about boundaries, resilience, and emotional exhaustion, a theme came up over and over. People weren't burning out because they didn't care. They were burning out because they cared too much about everything all at once. There's a kind of emotional overstimulation that happens when we haven't learned to detach without guilt. We start thinking we're responsible for everyone's moods, everyone's needs, every dropped ball in the room. And when that becomes your baseline, you're not living, you're emotionally over-punching. Let's get clear. Emotional detachment isn't turning off your empathy. It's creating enough internal space so you don't absorb everyone's feelings as if they're your own. There's this line I've heard in recovery communities that I love. Feelings are data, not directions. That means emotions are important, but they don't get to drive the bus. When you detach in a healthy way, you're not ignoring what you feel or what others feel. You're noticing, you're naming, and then you're making a conscious choice about how to respond. That's what discernment allows us to do. And the truth is, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and others is pause, not reply immediately, not react just to fill the silence, not take responsibility for how someone else might interpret your quiet. Emotional detachment gives you permission to sit in that uncomfortable space between stimulus and response and breathe. I've seen this work in real time, in leadership rooms, in marriages, in parenting, in high-pressure environments where emotions are running hot. The people who can detach, who can step back without shutting down, are the ones who maintain their integrity when things get messy. They stay grounded, not because they don't feel anything, but because they've learned how to not become everything they feel. So no, emotional detachment isn't a form of disconnection, it's a form of presence. It's what allows us to stay in hard conversations without losing ourselves. It's what lets us be empathetic without being swallowed whole. It's the space where we say, I'm here, I care, but I'm not going to carry what's not mine. And when we start living from that place of clarity, of discernment, we begin to reclaim parts of ourselves we didn't even realize we had handed away. The brain can't handle constant input without emotional burnout. Neuroscience backs this. Our prefrontal cortex, the part of us responsible for decision-making and empathy, gets hijacked when we're overwhelmed. Detachment allows for emotional regulation. which is not optional in a world where notifications and needs never end. It's like mental hygiene. We don't wait till burnout hits. We create space daily. I don't think we talk enough about what it means to be mentally and emotionally overloaded. It's not just being tired or having a lot on your plate. It's that slow, creeping sense that no matter what you do, it's never enough. That there's always another email, another crisis, another person asking for just a minute, and that minute turns into an hour you didn't have. Our nervous systems weren't built for this kind of constant input. I've sat with people across industries, teachers, executives, parents, trauma workers, and what I keep hearing is the same exhausted question. Why am I so drained all the time, even when I'm doing what I love? And the answer is this: love doesn't cancel out overload. Meaningful work, deep relationships, passion projects, they all demand energy. But without boundaries and rest, even the most beautiful things can burn us out. There's a piece of research I go back to often. When our stress levels are high and unrelieved, our amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for threats, goes into overdrive. That's when we shift into fight, flight, or freeze. And what's worse, our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that helps us make thoughtful decisions, solve problems, access empathy, that part goes offline. Literally, you can't access your best self when your nervous system is hijacked. Now think about how many of us are walking around in that state all the time. Constant emails, Slack messages, news alerts, social media pings, group texts, family drama, political noise, inner critic, external pressure. Repeat, our systems are not designed for continuous input without conscious output. And if we don't detach even briefly, we never get the reset we desperately need. That's where intentional emotional detachment becomes essential, because it gives us a break, not from caring, but from absorbing. It's the difference between saying, I have to be available at all times, versus I can love you and still take time to regulate my own system. I used to think pausing was a luxury, something you earn after you've handled everything. But that's not how our emotional and cognitive systems work. Pausing is preventive maintenance. It's brushing your emotional teeth before you get cavities of resentment, anger, or collapse. That daily emotional hygiene, stepping back, breathing, not replying right away, choosing stillness over scrambling, can quite literally rewire your brain for resilience. We don't need more hustle. We need more healing spaces in our day. Tiny detachment rituals. 5 minutes with no phone, saying no without over-explaining, closing the laptop even when the work isn't done, choosing to walk away from the argument, not because you're avoiding it, but because your brain isn't in a state to handle it well, and you know it. What emotional detachment really gives us is capacity. When we aren't constantly reacting, we create room for reflection, and when we reflect, we show up with more wisdom, more grace, and more patience. That's not weakness, it's strength with boundaries. I'll say it as simply as I can. You are not supposed to be emotionally on all day. You're allowed to step away. You're allowed to not engage. You're allowed to not carry everything. That space you create by detaching is where your sanity, your creativity, and your empathy are born again. And here's the truth. The world might keep demanding, but you get to choose when and how you respond. Detachment strengthens, not weakens relationships. We think if we're not emotionally on call 24/7, we're being selfish. But when we detach from urgency, we connect with intention. The data shows that secure relationships are built on presence, not pressure. I've seen people transform their marriages, parenting, even leadership styles by learning to pause, breathe, and not take on what isn't theirs. This point usually catches people off guard. We've been conditioned, especially those of us who value connection and care, to believe that closeness means constant access, that love means emotional availability at all hours, that good leaders, good parents, good partners, good friends are always tuned in, always ready, always on. But that's not closeness. That's codependence. That's emotional hypervigilance disguised as loyalty. Let me be clear, emotional detachment is not about apathy. It's not cold or distant or uncaring. It's about creating a healthy space in relationships so we can love each other more cleanly, without resentment, without control, without losing ourselves. And I want to talk about why that space matters. When we don't detach, we start merging. We start absorbing moods, responsibilities, even identities that aren't ours. I've talked to parents who are carrying their kids' emotional world so tightly that they don't even know where their own end and their children's begin. I've seen partners who try to regulate each other's stress, constantly tiptoeing, adjusting, rescuing. It's exhausting. And it often leads to exactly what we're trying to avoid: disconnection. Ironically, the more we emotionally entangle ourselves with people we love, the more reactive we become. Because when you've lost your center, every bump in the relationship feels like a full-blown earthquake. You can't hold space for someone when you've lost access to your own. Now, here's what the research tells us. The strongest relationships aren't built on nonstop closeness. They're built on emotional security. And emotional security comes from knowing that we can be separate and still be safe. That I can say, I need a minute, or I'm going to step away from this conversation and come back when I can think clearly, without it being interpreted as abandonment or rejection. When we learn to detach from urgency, we give ourselves and others the chance to come back to the relationship intentionally, not out of guilt or panic or obligation, but from a grounded place of choice. That's presence. That's what real connection feels like. It doesn't demand that we're always okay. It trusts that we'll return, even if we need a moment apart. I remember talking to a couple who had been married for over 3 decades. They told me their biggest breakthrough wasn't in learning to communicate better. It was learning how not to communicate when they were triggered. They learned to detach in the heat of the moment, to take a walk, to breathe, to not make the conversation worse by trying to fix something from a place of emotional chaos. And over time, that space they gave each other turned into the safest place in their relationship. Because here's the thing, when you detach from drama, you make room for clarity. When you detach from the need to fix, you create space for trust. When you detach from emotional urgency, you start to show up with calm curiosity instead of fear or control. That's how relationships grow. And if you're someone who has spent a lifetime over-dunctioning in relationships, over-apologizing, over-explaining, over-caretaking, I want to tell you, you are allowed to take a step back. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to not be the emotional lifeguard for everyone you love, because love without boundaries isn't sustainable. But love with space, with honesty, with intention, that's how we stay connected without getting consumed. People-pleasing is not empathy, it's emotional overfunctioning. Here's the hard truth. A lot of us confuse empathy with enmeshment, but empathy has boundaries. If you're carrying everyone else's emotional loads, you're not being kind. You're being depleted. I've lived this. I've worn the fixer cape, and I've learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can say is, "This isn't mine to carry." For a long time, I believed that being a good person meant saying yes, being available, being agreeable. I thought love was proven by how much I could carry for others. Their fears, their frustrations, their unmet needs. If someone was disappointed, I rushed to fix it. If someone was uncomfortable, I tried to ease it, even if it came at the cost of my own peace. And for a while, I got a lot of praise for it. You're so thoughtful. You're always there. You're the rock. But what nobody tells you is that when you become the emotional shock absorber for everyone around you, you start disappearing. You're so focused on soothing others that you forget how to soothe yourself. You stop asking, what do I need? What do I feel? What's actually mine to manage? That's not empathy. That's overfunctioning. It's an attempt to regulate your discomfort by trying to control someone else's emotional state. Empathy, real empathy, involves understanding someone else's experience without trying to solve it. It's about presence, not fixing, and it cannot exist without boundaries. Without emotional detachment, empathy quickly turns into enmeshment, where we stop being separate and instead become entangled in feelings that aren't even ours to process. Research backs this up. Studies on emotional contagion show that people who absorb too much of others' emotional states without healthy regulation experience higher levels of burnout, anxiety, and emotional fatigue. You may think you're helping, but what you're really doing is draining your own capacity to show up sustainably. And there's something deeper under all this. People-pleasing is often rooted in fear. fear of rejection, fear of being disliked, fear of not being enough, unless we're constantly accommodating. It's performative empathy. It's let me make sure you feel okay so I can feel safe. And that's a slippery slope, because when we trade authenticity for approval, we lose ourselves in the process. I've worked with leaders, teachers, parents, and friends who thought they were being supportive, but were actually rescuing people from feelings they needed to feel. And in doing so, they unintentionally blocked growth, accountability, and self-trust in the people they loved most. That's what happens when we confuse compassion with control. Saying, "This isn't mine to carry," doesn't mean you don't care. It means you're choosing not to drown in someone else's emotional ocean when you've barely learned how to swim in your own. It means you're practicing discernment. You're learning to stand next to someone in their struggle without making it your identity. And I'll say this, emotional detachment is what allows us to hold space instead of hold weight. It's what gives our empathy roots instead of wires. Because the moment you let go of being everything to everyone is the moment you start becoming more of yourself for the people who matter most. Emotional detachment creates room for purpose-driven living. When you stop reacting to everything, you start responding to what actually matters. That's the heart of it. Emotional detachment isn't just about regulation, it's about alignment. It frees you from constant distraction so you can live by your values instead of just surviving other people's expectations. For years, I lived in a cycle of emotional whiplash. Someone's upset, I feel responsible. A last-minute request, I say yes even if it derails my whole day. A message comes through, I respond immediately even if I'm already overwhelmed. I wasn't living, I was managing other people's needs, managing my image, managing chaos. And somewhere along the way I realized I didn't know what I actually wanted. I only knew what other people expected of me. Emotional detachment helped me find my way back. We don't talk enough about how noisy life gets when we're constantly emotionally entangled. That noise isn't just around us, it's inside us. It drowns out clarity, and clarity is what we need to live on purpose. When we detach, we quiet the noise long enough to ask, what matters most? What's worth my energy? What do I actually believe in beyond what I've been conditioned to perform? It's not easy, especially for those of us who've been raised to believe that productivity is proof of worth or that being busy is a badge of honor. But here's what I've learned. When we stop over-engaging with everything and everyone, we start tuning into what our lives are really about. Purpose doesn't shout. It doesn't push. It doesn't beg for our attention the way urgency does. Purpose waits, quietly, steadily. And we can't hear it when we're caught in the trap of reacting to every emotional cue that passes through the room. There's this myth that people who emotionally detach are cold or selfish or unavailable. I think the opposite is true. Some of the most purpose-driven, deeply compassionate people I know are also some of the most boundaried. They don't let emotional chaos steer their day. They don't choose every fire. They choose. And that choosing is an act of alignment. The research is clear. When people live in congruence with their values, they report higher levels of fulfillment, less anxiety, and more resilience. But you can't live in alignment if you're emotionally hijacked all the time. Detachment gives you the space to choose how you show up, to say yes to the things that give your life depth and no to the distractions that drain you. I've watched people who felt lost for years, burned out, depleted, unsure of their path, reclaim their power by practicing emotional detachment. They didn't stop carrying. They just stopped carrying what wasn't theirs. They started asking better questions. They got quieter, calmer, more intentional. And in that stillness, they found something they hadn't felt in a long time: direction. So when we talk about detachment, we're not talking about withdrawal. We're talking about returning to ourselves, returning to what we care about, returning to purpose over pressure, truth over noise, presence over performance. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're really craving. Not more connection to everything, but deeper connection to what actually matters. So here's the truth I hope you carry with you. Emotional detachment isn't a wall, it's a window back to yourself, to your boundaries, to your clarity. It doesn't make you less human. It helps you stay human in a world that too often asks you to be everything all at once for everyone. When we stop reacting to every tug, every tone, every expectation, we give ourselves the chance to respond with intention. And that space between reaction and response, that's where your power lives. That's where peace lives. That's where purpose takes root. You are not required to carry the weight of a world that keeps asking for more. You are allowed to choose calm over chaos. You are allowed to create space. You are allowed to belong to yourself first. So take a deep breath, step back when you need to, reclaim your rhythm, and remember, emotional detachment isn't disconnection, it's direction. Good luck out there. Protect your peace, lead with your values, and come home to yourself over and over again. You've got this.